So we're going to move now into reports from the 3 parallel sessions. So if the reporters could come up, starting with Arith Jatha.
So we had a very lively discussion on the role of partnerships within the context of the DWC strategy. And so just to give you a very brief background, partnership themes that were discussed included the role of people with disabilities within partnerships, intergovernmental integration, the role of business and labor, collaboration with the educational system, research and academic partnerships, review of partnerships on an ongoing basis to ensure meaningfulness of participation. So what I've done is just providing you with a key set of overview points that capture the nature of the discussion within each group in our section. So first and foremost, partnerships we acknowledged are the foundation of the DWC strategy and all related activities moving forward. All partnerships should provide value for all participants and enhance our ability to deliver programs and make policy change that promote the employment of people with disabilities. Also, participants in our group came to the consensus that partners should all be on the same page with regards to the goals and objectives of the partnership. As well, partners should also have the confidence to say no to a partnership and not feel pressured to be involved. One of the most important points that popped up was the meaningful integration of persons with disabilities within all partnerships, especially in leadership roles. At the same time, there's a need for financial, physical, and other types of resources so that people living with different disabling health conditions feel like they can play a meaningful role in partnerships. To effectively build meaningful partnerships, we need to make sure that all potential participants are invited and provided with equal opportunities. In our group, we talked about the need to recognize the missing voices. Often the most marginalized don't have a seat at the table, and we need to make more efforts to make sure that those individuals are included. At the same time, we also need to make sure that all levels of business are included in our partnerships, and participants in our group talked a lot about the role of business and the critical role they'll play in enhancing employment opportunities. At the core of everything was the role of trust, and that was a key element of meaningful partnership development. Participants mentioned a quote that I think I should just highlight to everyone in this room, and that is, "Change happens at the speed of trust." There is a need to build trust and capacity both horizontally and vertically across all levels of government. For instance, when we're thinking about different levels of government, not all stakeholders will have the same understanding of key barriers and facilitators facing people with disabilities. Similarly, different levels of government may have a different understanding of the employment landscape for people with disabilities and may be measuring outcomes differently. With regards to building partnerships with businesses, we need to acknowledge the diversity of workplaces. Workplaces can differ according to their size, unionization, as well as job sector, and we need to think about ways in which we can determine or which we can engage all these different types of businesses. There's a risk by not engaging these different businesses that they'll build interventions and in isolation from the work that we plan to do, and that'll add to silos. The importance of engaging business was underscored by the changing labor market. We need to understand how occupations are changing and the types of skills that employers require for people with disabilities to thrive within the changing labor market. There's a lot of value in sharing best and worst practices in our partnerships. These stories need to be shared widely. Businesses can particularly benefit from learning initiatives being launched by similar organizations with regards to the employment of people with disabilities. So really sharing the best case scenarios as well as challenges that employers face. And what participants in our group discussed was that information sharing across partners can enable us to break down silos and ensure different groups who are doing the same work are connecting with one another and not replicating efforts. Participants talked about the importance of building partnerships within the educational system to ensure students have access to the job skills necessary to succeed within the labor market. In particular, when we think about the school-to-work transition, there's a requirement to build programs that integrate the insights of diverse partners, including business, sport and leisure, recreation, as well as academia. The role of partnerships can be beneficial for both research, program development, as well as monitoring and evaluation. And in our section, we talked about partnerships as enabling standard approaches in terms of reporting, common indicators, as well as outcome measures. And this can really enable us to identify long-term implications from research and shape policy and practice. So, to summarize, sorry, I just got a note from Cindy saying I have 2 minutes left. I'm on point, okay? So I have 3 final recommendations that I will make, and I truly am done. The first recommendation is that we really need to emphasize the motto, nothing about us without us. And that should be at the core of all partnerships. People with disabilities should have leadership and decision-making opportunities. And the goal should be that partnership activities are then tailored to the needs of diverse people living with disabilities. The second recommendation is we need to create a process to formalize partnership development. And in our group, we talked about utilizing a partnership acquisition framework to build a value proposition of participating in a partnership. And a value acquisition framework will enable stakeholders to approach partnerships and to assess costs and benefits of participation. And very lastly, there's value in creating a network hub made up of all stakeholders. The goal will be to ensure that everyone knows about initiatives, research, and plans. Through a network hub, we can build common approaches to monitoring and evaluation and developing common metrics, sharing best and worst practices. So that summarizes the core of our discussion in the partnership team. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Arif. So I think we'll move next to disability-confident workplaces.
Okay. Good afternoon. So,
And maybe introduce yourself.
Oh, yeah. So, sorry, my name is Wendy Braithwaite. I am with the board of the CCRW. I'm also the CFO of Sodexo Canada. So in our group, we talked about implementation for a disability-confident employer. What things can we do to help in this initiative? And we answered a series of questions. So the first question was, what types of initiatives would we introduce? And so I'm going to run through the list. We talked about finding practical resources so that we can build on the knowledge of resources that we know that's already there and publish this so that employers can use it. Then we want to raise awareness of this knowledge. So create it, but then make sure that people know that it's there. We talked about measure the success by drawing out the best practices and improvements from there. We can create case studies and employer champions and business-to-business supports. Quite often, as we know, we tend to rely more on our peers, and so one employer talking to another employer about things that we can do to improve the working lives for people with disabilities is an effective way to build this space. We can also model disability-confident employers through networks. It would be useful, an initiative would be a centralized online toolkit. So a short way of saying that is a one-stop shop on accommodation. I've heard a lot about procurement being an issue sometimes, but if people know where to go easily, then it can help reduce some of the friction. We can create centers of excellence, again, building a knowledge for employers and publish this information. A lot of repetition here, but it's all about creating it, but then also publishing it and making the employers and people aware. Because it takes time to assemble the knowledge, right? It can take anywhere between 1 to 5 years, and so that's why we want to share and build collectively. The second question that we talked about was timelines, and we talked about what things can we do in the short term, the medium term, and the long term. So some of the short-term actions for employers are to make sure that they set their accommodation plans up quickly so that they can bring employees on quickly. There's no reason to wait until the start date. You can start putting things in place once the offer letter has been signed. On the short term, we can also foster trust through safe spaces. And then as we talk about medium and longer terms, that really comes into training people and helping to slowly realign the culture to be more welcoming. The next question we talked about is how best can we build on existing initiatives? So not everything has to be created from scratch, and many of these elements exist now. So some ideas are, for example, we talked about at the conference, we talked about how we can have job descriptions where they focus on functional skills as opposed to a certificate or a qualification. Well, today, we quite often hear employers do, and I talk about this, is transferable skills. And it's essentially the same idea. You think about the function and the skill rather than necessarily the specific qualification. So that's one of the ideas where there's an existing initiative that we can build on. Some of the knowledge base that already exists needs to be enhanced with episodic training. And we can build on the current government strategy. And then as a final step is to look internationally. There may well be best practices that we can build on in a Canadian context. The next question we talked about was intersectionality. So with universal design, intersectionality will be included automatically. So employers need to view workers as whole people with various identities. Training to employers, businesses, and senior management needs to include ASL information, LGBTQ+, hiring diversity, interpreters, and poverty training. Then when we looked at the key partners, who do we need to help us move this forward? And there are internal partners and external partners. So everyone from human resources groups to procurement to grassroots, interdepartmental governments, managers, industries, sector councils, chambers, associations, and networks. You know, one of the things that, one of the examples that we used at my table was that really the hiring manager makes a huge difference because that manager can really help bring on somebody. First of all, they open the door, but then they can help work with that person and help to move them through their process. And actually, the hiring manager can also set an example to the rest of the team, and then it grows organically. We talked about tools and resources. If I could sing, I would say money, money, money in an ABBA song, but a lot of this comes down to money, 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 funding, things around legislation, system navigators, disability specialists, IT, adaptive technology. So there are many tools and resources that we know of today that we can use. Maybe putting them into a national hub of training would be the best way to leverage these tools and resources. And then finally, we talked about measurement because, you know, what doesn't get measured doesn't really happen. So we recommend that employers develop a baseline. Where are we with respect to our ambition to hire more people with disabilities? And then let's see how our implementation plan moves us to where we want to do. We can use, as well as quantitative, we can also do qualitative assessments. We can also look at engagement surveys, customer surveys. You know, there are many millennials who want to and value companies that have a reputation for CSR. There will also be many people who value employers with a reputation for working with people with disabilities. And then finally, the last part of our session was around, well, how will I make a difference? And so many of us committed, we've submitted our names and the ways in which that we would commit to help move this forward. My personal commitment is, as a hiring manager, I will always have this at the forefront now. I will be thinking this way. But then also as a leader in my organization, and we employ 10,000 people, I will also be seeing how can I package this so that we're thinking about it in everything that we do. Thank you.
That's just terrific. Thank you so much, Wendy. And Cindy Moser will give the last report. It's from the discussion on comprehensive supports.
Hi, I'm Cindy Moser. I'm the Director of Communications at the Institute for Work and Health. And I was in a session that was talking about comprehensive supports for persons with disabilities, and we divided into 6 groups to talk about supports in different areas, anything from poverty reduction to school-to-work transition. First, I just want to mention a few cross-cutting themes that became apparent in our report backs. One of them is that people with lived experiences and the organizations that represent them or advocate for them are identified as key partners in almost every single initiative thought of. And that has implications about how to ensure that these organizations have the resources to do this. And it makes you think, are we going to have to, as a group, identify priorities, because it could be a lot for them. So that was just, and also, as Arif mentioned, we have to ensure we have a way to reach and include people living with disabilities who may not be represented by one of these organizations. So that was just one of the themes. In terms of the short-term goals identified, another theme was that many said the first thing that we needed to do was to canvass what initiatives, tools, and services are already out there in Canada and potentially beyond, and then communicate these in accessible ways. So that has implications in terms of, is there a one-stop shop or a repository that could be envisioned? And then another thing we noticed across the tables is that for many, developing resources for people with disabilities was often mentioned as one of the goals or activities. And so is there a way to work together to create these resources in a way that are accessible to people with disabilities in one place? Anyway, in terms of each of the 6 areas, I just want to talk about what their vision was, and then I'm just going to discuss, let you know some of the concrete activities that were proposed under each of them. So first, on preventing poverty, it's a world in which people with disabilities don't live below the poverty line, and some of the activities proposed were increasing income supports. One was offering a refundable disability tax credit with a more inclusive definition of disability, and there is work going on already. United Food and Commercial Workers and the Canadian Council of Disability are already working on that. Also advocating for basic income support. In another group talked about unbundling income and employment supports, and that's a world where universal access and coverage related to disability supports is embedded in all government programs. And the first thing was to ensure that persons with disabilities are heard at discussions that will go on about the universal pharmacare table, and work on that is already happening at the Canadian Labour Congress, so if anyone's interested in that, they can join there. Another activity proposed was expanding pharmacare to include a national disability support insurance program. There is an example of this already in Australia, and work on that is already going on with Every Canadian Counts. In terms of school to work, the vision is a Canada where students have clear pathways to employment supported by resources and accommodations post-graduation. One activity that they would like to see started there is compiling information about who is doing what already and communicating that to schools and students, and offering more labor market information. Some of the work already going on is Work Inc. Is it Work Inc. Alberta? Something. CCRW is already doing stuff, and I think we heard stuff yesterday coming out of New Brunswick and the David C. Only initiative. That was talked about. In terms of reforming government programs, the vision for that group was that all programs, tools, and services are accessible and inclusive by design. So they want word to get out that information is already being provided, in some cases, an alternative program in alternative formats, and then to develop user-centric tools. And they pointed to the CRA as an example. Another table was talking about addressing stigma and bias, and the vision there was that all people are seen as having valued skills, not as a charity case, but and their capacity is not presumed. So they wanted to develop free resources for people with disabilities, or even create a toolkit showing stories of success, and to develop training and support so that we can do away with wage subsidies in many cases. And then the third group talked about, the final group talked about education and guides for employers and persons with disabilities. And they wanted to do an inventory of what already exists and communicate that. And they wanted to develop guides, one for employers and one for employees, based on best practices.
Thanks very much. Wonderful.